Michael McLaren, host of Weekends on Radio 2GB, and Adam Walters, Brisbane Bureau Chief. I might add, men, we need two of you to fill in for Dennis Shanahan, who's taking a bit of a holiday. So I'm glad to have your company here on a Monday evening. Aston by-election, Michael, sobering news poll, of course. I've gone through all the detail at the top of the show. The party obviously needs to reset. The primary vote's down now 2 points to 33. Labor's lifted 1 point to 38. 2 PP terms, that's 55-45 to the government. It's been tough for Libs around the country. No joy for me sitting here on Saturday night, I can tell you. I tried to make the point, though, I know Melbourne well and I know Aston. There's a lot that went wrong in Aston on the weekend, a lot that needs to be fixed. Not an easy job for Peter Dutton. Can he do it?
Look, Peter, I'm yet to be convinced that he can, but of course, while he's in the game, of course, he's in with a shot. But what you said earlier, and I heard what you're saying on 2GB earlier with Luke Grant also today, I think was pretty sound, and that is that the Liberals need to fairly shortly, it is a 3-year cycle, of course, but fairly shortly start to really cement their position on key issues that matter to Australians. Now, we've just seen that whole rhetoric there around the voice with Julie and Lisa saying, oh, look, we sort of support it, but that clause number 2 is a bit of a problem. Look, the Liberal Party, on principle, should oppose it. And then that way, all this talk from Anthony Albanese about, oh, there's no bipartisanship and they're not saying nice things and it's always negative. Well, you can do away with that argument because they say, well, look, we don't in any way support this on principle. And then all the other details can back up that claim. And if they can prosecute that case simply and effectively and repeatedly, the public, I think, will understand why this is problematic. Similarly with energy, the sooner they really come to an understanding of how to get to net zero by whatever year, if indeed that's where they want to get to, the better, and prosecute the case. Now, I think you and I would agree nuclear power has to be part of that story. That's how you can potentially, by 2050, start to get credibly toward net zero in certainly electricity generation sense. But until they embrace that, it seems to be, as I would say, dusty Springfield politics, wishing and hoping stuff, and the public don't buy it. So they're not going to budge, are they? So, Peter's got to, really lead. He's united the party, we're told. That's lovely. Let's start leading the party, and if there's a few that can't stand the heat, well, let them go.
Unless he has a clear position on the voice, either they support it 100%, or they oppose it on principle, and I think it has to be opposed on principle. It's a racist intrusion into our constitution. Sitting on the fence on barbed wire gets you a pretty horrific result, and that's exactly where the Liberal Party is right now. Couldn't agree more. I'm not saying go back to first principles and fight the demon of climate change, but if you have accepted net zero, which they have, there's no sense there's a repudiation there, then you have to have nuclear on the table, and the wishing and a hoping is not getting them anywhere, as we saw on Saturday night. Gear change for you, Adam. There's an enormous concern about housing across the country. We talk about, obviously, this rate increase likely tomorrow with the RBA meeting. We know that about a third of rental properties have increased or are unviable. You just can't get in there. And then we've got housing companies collapsing. Now, if the demand's there, I'm asking questions of why these collapses. Porter Davis on Friday reported that here. Our 13th largest home builder, gone. Lloyd's, another firm, a little bit smaller, it collapsed also. Suggestions in the 9 papers today that 3 other national home builders are on the brink. What do experts say, Adam, is behind these builders going under?
Well, Peter, it's already beyond a crisis. That's pretty obvious. Now, the experts are saying that the building industry post-COVID is in desperate need of stimulation, but that's not happening. The figures for the demise of the housing industry make for alarming reading. It's just staggering when you look at the statistics from ASIC. The latest insolvency stats reveal more than 1,400 construction firms have gone under since June. And as the Greens push the government to scrap incentives for housing investors, it seems giant caravan parks and post-war style immigration camps might become the only viable options for a population set to expand so dramatically. All this before one even contemplates the disturbing level of existing homelessness now considered an emergency here in Queensland, Peter.
And so desperate is that Queensland Premier and his federal counterpart, I was just thinking to myself, Jim Chalmers in Canberra, that they need that 650,000 new migrants to prop up the budget. Just on a bit of travel there, Michael, we had Dan Andrews get back from his very secretive trip to China on Saturday. We hear today 2 more other Labor premiers are on their way to Beijing. Premier Mark McGowan, he goes for 5 days in a couple of weeks' time. And Anastasia Palaszczuk announces today too that she's off for a trip, possibly November. And talk from the Chinese ambassador in Australia that they're quite open to helping her fund the black hole that is the Brisbane Olympic Games.
Yeah, it's strange times, Peter. I mean, I might be living in a different universe or something, but I could have sworn only a couple of months ago we were talking about the need to spend more money than we could ever contemplate having on nuclear-powered submarines. I think we know why we're getting them. I could have sworn we've got Australians unfairly detained, it seems, in Chinese prisons. I could have sworn that I read somewhere or saw or heard somewhere that the Chinese Communist Party and the government there were putting ridiculous sanctions on Australian exports to try to cripple us for daring to try to work out the origins of COVID. And of course, the list goes on. It's almost exhaustless. And yet here we have state premiers going over there without Western media, without anybody even to hold the bags, just going over by themselves and having a good little chinwag around the table. Thanks to the Chinese media, we got a few photos at least. What they're talking about, we don't know. I'd imagine maybe when Premier Palaszczuk goes, there'll be a bit of talk, as you say, about some sort of funding agreement for the Brisbane Olympics in 2032. I don't think they'll be silly enough to sign anything like that. But look, the Chinese don't invest in Australia for sort of charitable reasons. They would do it for a return on the investment. What that return is, if it's capital or in kind, that's probably the pertinent question. But I don't know, but I would be surprised if the federal Labor government are completely comfortable with all of these solo trips by premiers. But there again, I can't imagine they'd go if the federal counterpart said don't. So something strange is going on.
What about this one, Adam? I picked it up today. The Melbourne Chamber of Commerce, Victorian Chamber of Commerce. Only 8% of workers are back in Melbourne Monday to Friday. Now, we know that the CBD is struggling. It's certainly better in Sydney. It's a little bit better even again in Brisbane. It's nowhere near pre-COVID levels. We know also that the Premier in Victoria in November put on the table this idea that we pay people, public servants, to work 5 days a week, but they only have to turn up for 4. How on earth do we get people back on their businesses back on their feet if we've only got 8% of workers back in the city Monday to Friday?
Peter, this is staggering to think Melbourne, which has always fancied itself as a cosmopolitan centre of cultural and business activity, would sit back and allow this to happen. I mean, the CBD of Melbourne is dynamic. It was the mercantile capital of Australia for so long. Going right back to the turn of the century, the early 1900s, when it was jostling with Sydney to become the national capital. To think that there's such a dramatic occupancy, a lack of occupancy in the CBD is hard to contemplate. And you've got to feel for all of those businesses that have set up in the inner city areas. Their livelihoods depend on the resurrection of the CBD. And for Dan Andrews just to sit back and allow this to happen after all the money that's been spent on infrastructure involving transport and getting people into the city, it just seems ridiculous. I mean, it's got to end at some stage.